Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. Hello and welcome to week 7 of Ruins and Haunting Heritage. On week 6, the students wrote their midterm paper, so we didn't have a lecture for week 6. To start week 7, we are covering a new book. It's called Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure, Remembering Ghosts on the Margins of History, edited by Sarah Surface Evans, A.E. Garrison, and Keisha Supernant. And this is a brand new 2020 book that is an edited volume, so each chapter is authored by a different person or different people and on a slightly different topic. So I was very honored to help with both the intro and the ending of this book, and my main role in it was that if you go to the end, I wrote a ghost story of every chapter after the intro chapter, and of course after my chapter, which is itself a little bit of a ghost story in there. So the point was that what is the difference between popular ghost stories and academic research into how the past permeates into the present? And a lot of the authors play with that, but they still, because of our training, we still write in a very kind of academic way that is a little more dry than people who are just seeking ghost stories about the past for entertainment and excitement. So I would read their chapter about their research, and then I would write a very short ghost story, which to me is the way their research might be spoken of in the future if somebody was speaking of it through total recall without referencing the article. So I'll read you some of those as we go through each article that has one, and then you could kind of see what I'm playing with and decide for yourself if it works and if it doesn't work. But one of the great things about this book, other than the fact that it has some really awesome people in it and putting it together, and these are all very respected scholars, so this is in no way pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeology, but the first page of the introduction, the first sentence is, "Do you believe in ghosts?" So, great opening, and the thing that most people say when they meet me and find out what I talk about, and I often, divert from that question to things that I think that are more interesting. So, the answer that the editors of the volume give in their introduction here is that you do not need to believe in paranormal ghosts to feel haunted. Right? So they say on page 1 that haunting is a communication of something that is difficult to articulate, an unspoken question. Ghosts are the manifestation of something that is missing, something indescribable, something unseen, lingering in the shadows of everyday experience. So that's what academics like archaeologists, sociologists, the types of people who are in the edited volume here are doing. We're looking at the things that linger, the things that are both seen and unseen, and we're using that to find the stories that are around that. Why are those people or places lingering in people's minds or on the landscapes? So still on page 1, they say, ghosts confront us with truths we may not wish to hear, which may be why we fear ghosts. Do we run from ghosts or do we listen to their stories? So I'm the kind of person who doesn't run from the ghosts. I try to find their stories, listen to their stories, and see why people tell their stories. Why is it important that this ghost story stays in our memory? So on page 2, they explain what the point of this book is for them, the editors. The authors in this volume demonstrate that specters do have empirical grounding and can be examined as institutions and social systems. The material remnants of the past can become crossroads of memory to be activated in the present. We identify the materiality of memory within objects, people, and landscapes. So that's what makes a lot of these chapters archaeology, that they identify the materiality of memory within objects, people, and landscapes. The practice of remembering and looking for ghosts seeks to undo the dehumanizing elements of social structures. Ghosts transmit knowledge in surprising and unusual ways. They are a way to return to a narrative and literary tradition that is not part of modernity in scientific writing. We talked about what modernity is earlier in the course when we were talking about the book After Modernity and the Archaeology of the Contemporary Past. So ghosts are a way of reaching across the material into depths that connect us to one another through time and space. So a lot of theory in there, but everything that's in there is reinforced throughout the book. So as we go through this book, and we'll go through the entire book, not necessarily in the order that the authors and the editors intended, but we will go throughout the entire book, and then we could return to that paragraph and see how that resonates with us later. So by embracing the ghostly or spectral, we can compress time and experience into a fourth dimension. We can time travel in our own minds and with our own emotions. So that's why the book is called Blurring Timescapes, because they're trying to experience this time travel in mind and emotion that happens when we talk about haunted landscapes, haunted places, and ghosts. And the point is to allow ourselves to become, albeit temporarily, possessed by the past that is imprinted on places or people. Archaeology, they say, in particular, is vulnerable to feelings of haunting, as our goal as archaeologists is to make sense of material culture from another time. So archaeologists are trying to do that time traveling of mind and of heart when they bring something from the past forward and show it to you and ask you what you think about it and tell you stories about it. The rest of the title, Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure. So what does subverting erasure mean in this title? And they say that the act of remembering in itself is subversion. So if contemporary social structures, if hyper-consumption and hyper-modernity, that everything is new for 5 seconds and then it's old again, is helping to erase our connections to each other and to place and to past, then the act of bringing those things back, of recalling them, of telling you the story of what used to be there, is a way of subverting that erasure. So we're blurring timescapes, we're time traveling, and subverting erasure, we are remembering at the same time. On page 3, they say the authors in this volume ask, what happens when the memories of a place, people, and events are systematically erased, forgotten, and covered up? So that's what we're subverting, this intentional or unintentional erasure, forgetting, and covering up. The authors explore hidden narratives and examine the social mechanisms operating on and organizing what is remembered and what is lost to time. So we seek to remember ghosts because they are often where the stories of everyday people are found, relegated to the margins of history. So this echoes what Michelle Hanks was talking about in her book, Haunted Heritage. Back to page 3, Confronting Ghosts allows us to exorcise the negative specters of colonialism, racism, gentrification, and capitalism. In other words, the telling of ghost stories can prevent the erasure of the very things that create ghosts. The sharing of ghost stories accesses the power of imagination and compassion. So this second part of this quote echoes back to the Harrison and Schofield archaeology book, After Modernity, where the act of doing archaeology is a way of exorcising ghosts by subverting that erasure. So still on page 3, they say, haunting is a type of experience and theoretical framing that brings us closer to understanding and empathizing with people, past and present. Telling these ghostly stories also helps us problematize the atemporality of our discipline, in that stories about haunting are non-linear, unlike scientific narratives. So one of the problems that I talked about in my chapter from Lost Cities, Found Pyramid, on archaeology as ghost hunting and ghost hunting as archaeology, is that one of the reasons that archaeology has lost a lot of its audience is that we are getting much more technical in the stories that we tell, versus how archaeologists were 100 years ago, where they didn't write in that kind of scientific narrative way. And when archaeologists say this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, they're putting a linearity on the story that itself is not linear, because why is that thing from the past in the present? It's because it wasn't this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, because the thing from there is here now. So using haunting as a way to improve archaeological narratives. On page 4, they say that we experience the past alongside and in our presence, existing as stories and material objects from times not our own. Our attachment to the objects and items associated with those moments bring eternal life to memories and people. So non-linear, more of a circular time, that when we speak about the people from the past, we bring them into the present, and this is a form of immortality. Jumping to page 6 of the introduction, they say that museums curate and display specimens often acquired through questionable ethical practice, but museums that ignore or gloss over past ethical wrongdoings diminish their ability to haunt the visitors as a productive teaching tool. So thinking about how museums are one way that most non-archaeologists experience archaeology, and that archaeologists spend a lot of time thinking and talking about ethics of collecting, the ethics of how certain things got into museums. But then in the museum itself, you usually don't have that ethical concern, those histories. It's just, here's an arrowhead. It came from this time period, but it doesn't explain how it got into that museum. And that, they're saying, is a missed opportunity, that if we can haunt museum visitors with our objects, we could bring them into that dialogue and conversation. Still on page 6, the past, present, and future are knitted together through experiences of loss, trauma, and injustice brought about by capitalism. And this goes back to the Harrison and Schofield's book, After Modernity, again, that it's that capitalism is this constant search for progress and improvement and a discard of anything that came before, right? Your iPad from 2 years ago is already trash, right? So this is creating a lot of this sense of what is the past, what is the present, what is valuable, and what is the future. And there's a lot of loss, trauma, and injustice wrapped up in that quest for something in the future that we're not even sure what it is, but we know that it's better than this. So on page 7, trauma lingers in places and passes through generations, causing disorientation of memory. So that's a lot of our hauntings, and a lot of our ghosts are about this trauma that happened in places, and the ghost stories help to speak of that trauma as a way of explaining it that causes people to keep it in their memory and causes people to want to hear about these stories so that they can place them within that context. So the next chapter is a chapter by me about telling ghost stories. And a lot of what is in that chapter is stuff that I've already talked about in the other lectures for this course. So I'm just going to hit on two main points that I pulled out. So on page 13, I say that ghost stories linger in the mind of a reader or listener because a well-told ghost story is a delightful thing to experience. There is nothing that must be recalled other than the feeling of wonder and the takeaway message: don't forget what has happened here. And I think that's a lot of what archaeology does, right? We're site-based. We go to a place and we tell excruciatingly detailed stories about what happened here. And we want people to not forget what happened in that spot, but yet we often give them way too many details that they can't remember what happened there. So on page 14, I say that haunted places are simply locations where the living can slip from the present into a real, imagined, or idealized past. The boundaries between now and then are the thinnest at ruins, sacred sites, sites of exceptional beauty, and places whose history can be felt by those with sufficient knowledge or empathy. To connect to the story of a place is to experience its ghosts. So that could connect to lots of the different readings that we've already done. Michael Mayerfield Bell's Ghosts of Place, Yi-Fu Tuan's Space and Place, right? So one of the reasons that I think the telling of ghost stories is a job for archaeologists is that these sites where the past is permeating into the present in a visible way, especially ruins, is a place that it's easier for people to connect to that past and therefore be haunted by the ghosts that are there. So the next chapter is called Material Memories. This is Erica Begun, Material Memories, Interpreting Souvenirs and Heirlooms in the Archaeological Record. And this chapter is about a region of the world that I haven't spoken of yet in this course, Mesoamerica or Central America. And she starts off this chapter, Erica does, by saying that Mesoamerican cultures often buried their dead within their homes. And this is a common practice throughout the world, especially when people died in cold months when the ground was frozen. The ground inside the house would still be unfrozen because of the activities that go on in there, the cooking in hearths, the people living on top of it. So not as much a problem freezing ground in Mesoamerica, but in places like New York, the ground freezes, and therefore if somebody dies over the winter, there's an actual problem of how to handle the body in ways that you can't just dig the usual burial place. So many cultures would have two stages of burial in that case, and the first would be in the home, and then in a warmer month they would have a celebration and a feast where they would gather up the bodies of all of the people who had died over the winter, and they would create one large burial and have a big ceremony to inter them all together. So the idea that the dead should be far away is a relatively new idea in human history. In some cultures, the dead are supposed to be kept close to you because they are your family. So on page 20, she says, by burying the dead within the household, the living could protect the graves and keep their dead close, thus inviting them to continue to be a presence in the world of the living. So while we don't necessarily do that today with interments, people buried in the ground, we do this a lot today with cremated human remains. Right? When somebody's cremated, oftentimes that person stays in the home, in their urn or whatever container the ashes are put in. And coincidentally, the commonplace in at least TV and movies is to put that urn of your loved one on the mantelpiece, so by the fire, right? So this is very similar to, in the past, if you're burying your loved one in your house, the ground is the most easily dug up near the fire. Lots of us don't have fireplaces to put cremated loved ones' remains, so that's more of, I think, a movie set and a TV show thing than it is in real life. But we also now have companies that will take the ashes of your loved one and turn it into jewelry so that you could wear them. So this idea that the dead should be with you is something that is a human universal in certain ways, that the dead body as a body is often put away somewhere else, but some aspect of that dead person kept with you, close with you. So on page 21, she says, peaceful deaths at the end of long lives rarely result in hauntings within westernized views of ghosts. There is a fine line between memory and ghosts, and when these are combined with the trauma of death, you can see the emergence of spirits as active figures in the lives of the living in the form of ancestral spirits. These are the ghosts that can be safely welcomed as the relationships and connections between family and friends are maintained past the limits of life. So, several things in this short section that goes from the end of page 20 to the beginning of page 21. So, in Western ideas, if you die peacefully, you don't become a ghost, you become a spirit. If you've seen, there's a Twix commercial, that what's the difference between the right Twix and the left Twix in a package of this chocolate bar that is two separate chocolate bars in one. And in one of the versions, a Halloween version of the Twix commercial, there's two ghosts that are saying it's like the difference between a ghost and a spirit, and they're laughing. And it's funny because a lot of people have never really thought of the difference between a ghost and a spirit. So in westernized views, ghosts are people who have some trauma that is unresolved that causes them to linger. Whereas a spirit is an ancestral person who has the choice to visit you when they visit you and not, that they're rarely corporeal, they're rarely a body, right? They're more of a shadowy thing, a dream, a feeling, a butterfly. Right, so thinking of these with that, what we just talked about, the difference between having a body to bury and having a ashes of an individual turn into a necklace, right? So the body would be distasteful because it's more of a ghost, because bodies shouldn't just be lingering around. But that the ashes of your loved one is more symbolic of the spirit of that person. So this is important for understanding how various cultures allow for ghosts to exist, back to our taxonomy from week 1, but ghosts to exist in a peaceful, loving spirit sense, but not for ghosts to exist in a malevolent stranger that's trying to hurt you because of something you didn't have anything to do with in your mind. So bringing this back to archaeology and artifacts found in excavations, Erica talks about the difference between heirlooms and souvenirs, right? So this maybe is a pitch for a new right Twix versus left Twix commercial. What is the difference between an heirloom and a souvenir? So she says heirlooms and souvenirs are one way to be haunted by ancestral spirits. So in her definition, an heirloom is something that you inherit that has a memory of a person associated with it, whereas a souvenir is something that you collect and keep to remember an event or a place, but not necessarily a person, right? So in the archaeological record, she says on page 21, we spent a lot of time on objects, soil colors, and bones, because these are full of information that we as archaeologists are trained to understand. Archaeologists rely heavily on the concept of context, the spatial, temporal, and relational information about the material remains gained from excavation in order to interpret the archaeological record. We draw meaning from the material culture of the past based on those relationships. So whenever we find something, say a body, it matters just as much where we found that body than it matters that we found the body. So going back to what we were just talking about, if I found a body on your mantelpiece next to your fictitious fireplace, I'm calling the police. But if I find ashes on your fireplace mantle, I'm asking you about your loved one. So context, association. Archaeologists are obsessed with where they found things because it has a lot to do with the meaning of that thing that we found. In the same way, we have to think about what do we do when we find something in an unexpected place. So often the joke is that archaeologists will say, well, it was part of a ritual. That's why it doesn't make sense. So say, for example, I find a fork, a spoon, and a plate on the floor in the bottom of your closet. Just sitting there. Doesn't make sense. Right? It's not in a box. Right? It's using up valuable closet floor space. How do I explain that context? So archaeologists often discount it as, well, it was something that the person was doing that isn't within their regular way of life. Unless you're eating breakfast at the bottom of your closet alone, maybe that's part of your ritual, right? So she's trying to get past that explanation that it's a ritual with her case study here of pottery in an area of the Mexican city of Teotihuacan that is not pottery from Teotihuacan. So is this evidence of a long-term cultural affiliation of this other group with Teotihuacan, or is it evidence of souvenirs kept to recall a past connection with that place? So on page 22, she says, archaeologists might apply the notion of heirlooming to explain many of these objects that seem out of spatial temporal context, and thus begin to tell a deeper, richer, and fuller story of those who have come before us. On page 24, ownership of a souvenir marks a person as one who has been somewhere and has returned changed from that journey. Souvenirs reflect the desire to carry that past experience into the present and future, using the object as a tool of remembrance. So here's an example for you. If you travel a lot by car, when you go into gas stations along highways, they often have magnets in the shape of the state that you're in. And they're all made at the same scale so that you can basically come home, go to your refrigerator as the largest magnetic surface in your house that is publicly visible, and put a magnet of that state there as proof that you've been there. So what's the point of doing that? It's a very public display, right? You know you went there, you have other souvenirs, but having those magnets on the refrigerator is a way of marking yourself as someone who has been somewhere, and therefore you're somehow better than you were before you went to those places. And that you want to remember, and you want other people to remember that you've been to those places. So that souvenir, that magnet of South Carolina that is on your fridge, is a tool of remembrance, but also a tool of social standing. So on page 24, Erica says, people have a need to bring things home with them because travel is otherwise ephemeral and liminal, a fleeting yet sacred and extraordinary experience. Souvenirs prove that something important happened, something worthy of remembrance. So it is very egotistical to think that it's only us in today's world that does this. So people in the past often would find objects that were from the past before them, and they would often curate them and put them as sacred objects, as important objects in burials. So one of the sites that I wrote up in New York State as part of my PhD dissertation had arrowheads or projectile points of a much older time period in a burial of a dog that we could radiocarbon date that dog because it's organic tissue. We radiocarbon dated a piece of the jaw that is from a completely different date than we usually ascribe to that arrowhead. So it's ritual, but it's also an act of remembrance. So on page 24, Erica says that souvenirs recall place while heirlooms recall relationships to people. The life of material culture extends far beyond that of the original owner, bringing with it a sense of memory of previous owners and their lives. As objects are passed down through the generations, so too are the stories that accompany them. The object is filled with the specter of the past individual, which can also be curated and cherished along with the physical object. So maybe that arrowhead was made by the old man whose dog that was, and he made that arrowhead in the style of his grandfather. Therefore, the arrowhead isn't really from that much earlier time period, but instead it's a way of that man remembering his grandfather and putting his grandfather in the same burial as his beloved dog, right? So this is how archaeology can use these ideas of ghosts and hauntings as a way of seeing the archaeological record in a more human way than in a more scientific way. So on page 25, Erica says that heirlooms act as the voice of the ghosts of the past for those who inherit these important objects. If you inherit something from your grandfather, you probably don't want to let it go because it reminds you of your grandfather, right? So I have a heirloom on my wall here, if you're watching the video, and it is a little cuckoo clock, and that cuckoo clock was hung in my grandparents' kitchen in Queens, New York throughout my childhood. And when I would stay with them overnight, I would always wind it up and make it so that the little girl on the swing underneath it would go up and down, up and down, up and down. And I would drive my grandparents crazy. It was their clock, but they never wound it up. And they never had the little girl on the bottom of the cuckoo clock going up and down. But when they both died, I took that, and it has always hung in the kitchen of my house ever since, even though I keep moving, but I keep it there. So that heirloom is the voice of the ghosts of the past, right? That heirloom is my grandparents on my wall. So getting back to Teotihuacan, within Teotihuacan's neighborhoods, there's areas that have objects from other cultures. So we could say that those areas were where people from those other cultures dwelled. But what evidence do we have for that? So the things that people use as expressing their identity, such as language, food, and clothing, probably don't preserve in the archaeological record. So therefore, what do you have left? So in the archaeological record in Central America, we have tons of ceramics. So pottery, vessels, plates, cups, bowls, but also pottery that was made into dolls or figurines. So less than 1% of what was recovered in that area was from this completely different culture. So it is not within their realm of variation of what they do. These materials were discovered in two distinct contexts, Erica tells us. Whole pots that were found in burials and broken sherds found in household midden context. So a midden is a trash pile. As souvenirs, they could have had symbolic significance connecting the owners of the objects to the region they or their ancestors had visited. As heirlooms, their presence in the compound may indicate an attempt by the occupants to maintain their connections, whether of ethnic origin, cultural affiliation, or travel, through the keeping of objects of memory. If the breakage of these objects was intentional, it reflects a conscious desire to distance oneself from the materiality of memory represented by heirlooms. Once the connections were severed, the objects lost their significance and thus could be disposed of without fear or worrying of offending a supernatural presence. So if something happens to me, who is left to defend my clock heirloom? Right? If I wind up dying and the apartment complex I live in wanted to rent out this apartment again, they would come in and they would throw that in the trash, and it would probably break in the process. So therefore, the breakage of an heirloom, of something that doesn't belong within the context that it's in, but was carried there by somebody intentionally trying to recall a connection to the past, the breakage of that object reflects the breakage of that connection. That without me, that object doesn't have the same connections, it doesn't have the same spirits attached to it. So lastly, from this chapter, page 31, archaeologists are adept at teasing out the threads of complex human behavior from the material record. However, some behaviors are easier to see archaeologically than others. Often, items that may have been curated by families over generations end up being labeled as ritual objects due to their odd temporal context. But by seeking alternative ways of understanding the complexity of human behaviors that result in objects being found out of temporal context, archaeologists may be better able to understand the ways in which ancient people sought to express and preserve their own memories of the past.